Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. It's been a few days. Even though we're off work and we're not at school, life still gets busy. So I need to catch up. Got my new mug. It says, "Live a pineapple life. Stand tall, wear a crown, and be sweet on the inside." So going to put that down. Open the book. We are on, like my sweatshirt. We are on chapter 6, the symbol of the ceiba tree. So I'm really interested. I think I guess it makes sense that this book, the last one was about Rick, and now this one's going to be about Sarah. And really, one of the earlier ones, we learned a lot about Dak. And so it's going to be interesting if this book's going to continue exploring different, like, we know they're going back in history, but like, is it going to always be mostly about one of the kids? I don't know. So this one we know Sarah's very in tune with. The symbol of the ceiba tree. Sarah continued down the hill beside Rick, overcome with guilt about leaving Dak's side. Her best friend still had not regained consciousness, and she wanted to be the first thing he saw when his eyes opened. And who knew what crazy potion that mystic might try without her supervision? But when Rick had stirred her from a restless sleep, he reminded her of Dak's last words about the people inside the observatory. The least they could do, he reasoned, was honor their friend's wishes by checking it out. So here Sarah was, trekking down to the observatory. The guilt tightening like a noose around her neck with each step she took away from the cave. I mean, just look at it, Rick continued. It's incredible what Kiza was able to do without the help of modern tools. Wow, it really is, Sarah said, rolling her eyes. Rick hadn't stopped talking about Kiza and his new bracelet since, oh yeah, she gave him a bracelet in the last chapter, and his new bracelet since they started their walk. He had already explained his theory about being the snake charmer from the riddle. He believed she might hold the key to discovering the break they needed to fix. He described for Sarah the deep conversation he'd had with Kiza, which had lasted into the morning. Now he was obsessing over the artistic merits of the bracelet she'd given him. Rick was so caught up in Kiza talk that he didn't even seem to notice all the storm damage they were passing. The thick tree branches strewn all over the dirt path, the massive reddish-brown puddles and blown-off roots, the smaller huts on the outskirts of the village that had been completely flattened. And it's surprisingly comfortable, Rick said, spinning the bracelet around his wrist for Sarah to see. I never thought of myself as a bracelet-wearing kind of guy, but this thing's a different deal. I really dig it. I'm sure you do. Sarah hadn't quite known Rick long enough, but she was willing to go on a limb and say he was acting out of character. Not that she had time to worry about Rick's character at the moment. Her focus was on getting to the observatory, finding out whatever it was that they were supposed to find out, and then getting back up to the cave to check on Dak. When Sarah looked up a few minutes later, her eyes grew big, and she stopped in her tracks. The observatory. Rick turned around. I bet Kiza would make something too if... Look, Sarah interrupted, pointing ahead of them. Yesterday, the observatory had been nearly as tall as the temple, and now Sarah was staring at a heap of rubble. Uh-oh. So what if they did need that and it's gone? The storm, Rick said under his breath. Sarah's body went cold. Most of the roof had been stripped away. The walls were folded in on one another and crumbling near the base. A dozen men, including Ithic, were standing on top of the wreckage, calling out names and carrying debris away stone by stone. Sarah and Rick took off running down the hill. Uh-oh. Sarah quickly learned that there were 3 elders trapped inside. Cocombe, Cain, Bor, and Pascal. Okay, I'm confused. They just said 3, but they had 4 names. Oh, I'm sorry. Cocombe, Cain, Bor, and Pascal. They were the reason everyone was working at such a frantic pace. Ithic kept calling out the names and digging through the rubble, trying to determine the location of the voices that occasionally echoed back. Sarah and Rick worked alongside the Mayans. Initially, there were a dozen Mayan men helping out, then 2 dozen, then 3. All of them hoisted boulders nearly as big as their own bodies. Women started pitching in, older children. By late afternoon, there were over 200 people milling around the observatory wreckage, carrying away rocks. Those too young or too old to lift debris ladled fresh water from buckets into cups and passed out fruit to those who'd been working since morning and refused to take a break. Nearly every face Sarah had seen in the cave that night before was out here, helping digging the elders out from under the debris. So soon the sun started to set, but that didn't slow the Mayans. So it didn't slow Sarah either. She lifted as many smaller stones as she could manage, carrying them to one of the several piles of rubble near the temple. Rick did the same, Kaisa now working at his side. Sarah occasionally scanned the crowd for Dak, hoping he'd woken up and demanded to join the rescue efforts. She knew that's exactly what he would do. But there was no sign. Cocombe, Ithic continued to roar. Cain, Bor, Pascal. Who are these people anyway? Sarah asked Rick and Kaisa as she tossed 2 grapefruit-sized rocks under the pile of rubble. Wise men, right? Rick asked Kaisa. Kaisa wiped sweat from her brow and nodded. They are the scribes of our village. Why were they in the observatory during the storm? Sarah asked as the 3 of them started back toward the wreckage site. Only Ithic knows for sure, Kaisa said. Though many believe they were working on a secret project to be studied by the men of Ucom, the Great, king of Calakmul. There's hard names in this book. His men will be visiting our village in a few days' time. I still can't believe Ithic is a king, Sarah said, recalling what Rick had told her on the way down the hill. He never even let on last night. He is our king, Kaisa said, but more important, according to Ithic himself, he is a father and a husband and an uncle. Sarah nodded. But she was having trouble wrapping her head around these Mayans compared to the Mayans she had read about. Ithic didn't set himself apart from everyone. She thought that's what all kings did, and it moved her to see everyone pitching in to help rescue the elders. When Kaisa broke off to get a cup of water, Sarah took Rick by the arm. Did you ask her about the riddle? He nodded. In a roundabout kind of way. Apparently, when she was little, she survived a bite from a deadliest snake in the lowlands. Her uncle said she needed to honor the snake for not taking her life. That's the reason she worked snakes into her jewelry. Seems weird for it to just be a coincidence. I'll keep working on it. Sarah let out a defeated sigh. What are we doing here, Rick? Dak's hurt and the ring is malfunctioning, and we aren't getting any closer to understanding the riddle. I'm so confused. I am too, Sarah. We just have to keep searching. Sarah saw Kaisa approaching with 2 cups of water. At least Rick had made a friend, she thought, which made her think of poor Dak, laid up in the dingy cave alone. Kaisa turned a cup to both Rick and Sarah, and they thanked her. As Sarah finished her water, she heard a small commotion building on the other side of the rubble. She set down her cup next to Rick's and Kaisa's, and the three of them hurried around the wreckage toward the gathering crowd. "What's happening?" Kaisa asked a stocky Mayan woman. "They've spotted the scribes underneath the wreckage," the woman said excitedly. "They're alive." Sarah pushed her way around several people to see for herself. Ithic was right up front, calling out, "Pascal, remain calm. We will get to you. We will get you out of there." He turned to the group of men next to him and said, "It's a miracle they're not harmed. Now let's hurry." It took another hour to clear the wide enough tunnel from the scribes to climb out. Sarah watched them emerge one by one, dirty but otherwise unscathed. The last man who came out was carrying a large tablet of bark-colored paper, which was filled with strange-looking glyphs and paintings. He handed the tablet to Ithic, who looked it over, saying, "How did you survive, Pascal?" Pascal pointed at the tunnel. "We huddled to the wall with a kilab tree. It saved our lives." Ithic smiled and nodded, looking back and forth between the three filthy men, and said, "It is our good luck charm, as always," he said. "While we were trapped, I decided I would paint the tree onto the first and last pages of the Codex," Pascal said. "I believe it will be a worthy addition." "Yes, absolutely." Sarah couldn't believe what she was seeing, an actual Mayan codex. She ducked down so she could peer into the narrow hole. It was dark inside, but once her eyes adjusted, she was able to make out a large tree painted on the wall. She got goosebumps and quickly turned to Rick. "The riddle!" "I was thinking the same thing," he said. It was late by the time Sarah made it back to the cave and Dak's bedside. He was still unresponsive, though Josal seemed to think his condition had improved. Sarah wasn't sure. If anything, Dak's injuries looked worse. There was a lump the size of a softball on the back of his head. The back of his arms and shoulders were entirely black and blue. "He looks awful," Sarah said. "It's not important how it appears on the outside," Josal said, waving more incense over Dak's bare chest. "It is his insides that matter, and there's no longer a danger of his brain swelling." Sarah stared at Dak. She was beginning to trust Josal a little more, though she still wished she could back up his claims with an MRI. Once Josal left, Sarah pulled out the S-Square and powered it on. I wonder how they keep it charged. Well, I'm sure their batteries last a long time. She and Rick had ducked behind a huge tree outside the village to study the riddle before trekking back to the cave. But even knowing that the symbol of the Chiba tree was part of this local codex, they were just as lost. The riddle came up, and she read it aloud to Dak over and over, hoping something would jump out to her. A snake charmer and a clown, a treasure that was never found, a gift from the deity Ismana from 9.10.5.10.7 to 11.17.2.13.10. Trace the symbol of the Chiba tree toward the truth of the curse. Sarah read each phrase a dozen times, but they still didn't add up to anything, and Dak just lay there, unmoving. Next, she booted up the ring. She had been able to get the display working again, but something was still wrong. The ring wouldn't accept any new data. Every time she inputted new coordinates, she got an error message. It was deeply troubling. Eventually, she shut off both machines, curling up on the ground next to Dak's cot, and closed her eyes. She pushed Dak and the riddle out of her mind and instead focused on her trip to the cataclysm. She remembered the flooding streets, the blood-red sun, but as soon as she saw herself reaching for the doorknob of her house, things went blank. Again. What had she seen that was so awful her mind wouldn't let her remember? Chapter 7 is A New Purpose, and I will do my very best to read that tomorrow. Boys, I know I'm not going to see you for several weeks, And I miss you, and I hope you're having a good time, and I hope you're able to get a little work done and do chores and do all the fun stuff and relax and rest up. And we will continue as a class to read book 4 of the Infinity Ring, Curse of the Mayans. And I will see you again later. Bye.